What would you do if the child you raised, the one you loved more than life itself, looked you in the eye and said, "You can either serve my wife and her mother, or you can hand over your savings and move out"? What would you do if the boy whose scraped knees you bandaged, the boy who used to fall asleep on your shoulder during thunderstorms, suddenly saw you as nothing more than an inconvenience, an obstacle, an extra mouth at his dinner table? This is not just a story of betrayal. It is a story of awakening. A woman left behind, walked over, and nearly erased until she finally said, "No more." You see, I didn't raise my son to become the man he became, but I also didn't spend 68 years of my life sacrificing everything, only to grow old in a house where I was treated like hired help. This is my story. And if you've ever been made to feel invisible by the people you loved the most, I want you to lean in. Because sometimes, the best revenge is peace. The sweetest justice is joy. And the loudest, "I told you so," is silence. Don't forget to comment where you're watching from. Let's dive in. I didn't cry when he said it. I didn't scream or throw my coffee mug across the kitchen like you see in the movies. I didn't collapse into a dramatic heap on the floor, and I didn't beg him to take it back. I just stood there, hands still damp from washing his dinner plate, staring at the man I gave my life to, the boy I raised, and tried to understand how we got here. His voice was calm. Too calm. That's what made it worse. Like it wasn't even cruel. Like it was just reasonable. "You can either stay and help my wife and her mother with the house, or you can hand over the savings and move out." No emotion, no hesitation, not even shame. Just a choice delivered like it was fair. The plate in my hand slipped back into the soapy water with a soft clink, and I looked at him. Really looked at him. 33 years old. Hair the same sandy brown it was when he was 5. The same eyes that used to squint up at me with a smile when I'd surprise him with pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Those eyes were different now. Cold. Distant. Like I was someone he'd grown tired of accommodating. I wanted to ask him who put this idea in his head. But I didn't have to. I already knew. Ever since he married her. Ever since that wedding where I was seated 2 rows behind the bride's mother, where I was asked to wear beige so I wouldn't clash with the photos, I felt it. The shift. The quiet replacement of my voice with hers. And then, they moved in. First, it was just supposed to be for a few weeks. Until they got on their feet. Then it was a few months. Then her mother came. And suddenly, I was the extra body in my own home. The woman in the corner. The unpaid maid. The person whose pantry was reorganized without permission. Whose TV remote was replaced. Whose recipes were tossed. Whose birthday was forgotten. But I stayed quiet. Because that's what I'd always done. I made excuses. Told myself it was temporary. Told myself he'd come around. That he was just adjusting to marriage. That it wasn't personal. But it was personal. Because the day he looked at me, not with love, not even with frustration, but with impatience, and told me to hand over the savings, that was the day I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. I didn't recognize us anymore. It's strange. The moments that break you aren't always the loud ones. Sometimes they're quiet, casual, served with a cup of coffee at 9:07 in the morning by the same hands that used to wrap around your neck for goodnight hugs. That's what hurt the most. Not the demand, but the ease with which it left his mouth. I wiped my hands on a dish towel that wasn't mine, bought by his bride, white and embroidered with some phrase about blessed homes, and I turned toward the window. I didn't say a word. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because the weight in my chest was too heavy for words to carry. I stood there as the sun came through the glass in thin, tired strips, warming the floor where he used to play with his toy trucks. I used to kneel there with him, pushing little plastic wheels across the tiles, pretending we were racing to the moon. Now I stood alone, silent, aching in places I didn't know could ache. He waited, I think, for me to argue, to protest, maybe even to surrender. But I didn't, because something in me had snapped, not in rage, not even in sorrow, just snapped. And in that hollowed-out place where my hope had lived, something else began to grow. Not anger, not yet, but something harder than sadness, something that sounded a little like resolve. I didn't know then that I'd be boarding a plane just 3 days later. I didn't know what paradise looked like. I just knew it wasn't here. Not in this house. Not in this life where I was expected to serve my silence like tea. So I dried my hands. And I breathed. And I began, without knowing it, to leave. I didn't leave that morning. I made the bed like I always did. Folded the corners tight, hospital style, just the way my mother taught me when I was 12. I fed the cat, took the trash out, washed the windows until the streaks disappeared. Routine clung to me like armor. And in the quiet repetition of tasks, I almost convinced myself I was okay. But I wasn't. Something had cracked inside me, subtle but irreversible. A fault line in the ground beneath my feet. And though I was still in the house, still putting dinner on the table, still folding laundry that didn't belong to me, I had already started to drift. He didn't notice. My son. The boy who used to beg me to watch him sleep when he was sick. The one who cried at 10 when the neighbor's dog died and buried a shoebox in our backyard with a handmade cross. That boy was gone. Replaced by a man who now called me Mom, like it was a formality. Like it was something he'd grown tired of saying. I watched him that evening, sitting on the couch with her, my daughter-in-law, his bride. She was laughing at something on her phone. He leaned over, showing her a meme. They shared a private joke, one I wasn't invited to. Her mother was in the armchair, legs tucked under her like she owned the place. She did, in a way. Her perfume lingered in the hallway. Her Tupperware filled my fridge. Her voice, sharp, nasal, authoritative, carried louder than mine ever had. That night I lay in bed, the ceiling above me blank and endless. I stared up at it, wondering how a life could slip through your hands without you noticing. I had done everything right. I had given everything. Worked 2 jobs when he was in school. Skipped meals to pay for braces. Missed funerals to make sure he had someone at his soccer games. I had spent my whole life pouring myself into his future, like water into a cracked vase. And now that future had no space for me. I turned to face the nightstand and opened the drawer slowly. Inside, beneath old birthday cards and receipts I couldn't bring myself to throw away, was a small leather folder. My savings account passbook. I hadn't looked at it in years. I'd always imagined it would go to him one day. Help with a house. His children's education. Something meaningful. Something shared. Now, he wanted it like a transaction. A payment in exchange for my place in this house. I ran my hand along the spine of the folder, fingers trembling. And then I opened it. The number inside didn't surprise me. I'd kept it healthy, careful. Every dollar set aside from years of saying no to myself. No to the vacation. No to the new car. No to the dress in the window I always stopped to look at but never touched. It hit me then, how much life I had postponed. How much of myself I had set aside in the name of motherhood. And for what? I closed the book, sat up, swung my legs over the side of the bed. My feet hit the cold floor with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The next morning I made breakfast. Bacon, eggs, toast. Just like I always did. He didn't say thank you. She didn't look up from her phone. Her mother commented that the toast was a little too crisp. I nodded, washed the plate, and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed, pulled out my laptop, and typed into the search bar. Oceanfront long-term rentals. Quiet, peaceful, safe. And then I stared at the blinking cursor. For the first time in my life, I was about to choose something for myself. And I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. It's strange how heavy your own name feels when you start typing it into a rental inquiry form. Like each letter carries every invisible weight you've ever carried. Every yes you said when you wanted to say no. Every quiet sacrifice. Every birthday spent alone with a reheated dinner and a too-silent phone. Name, email, move-in date. I filled them in with mechanical precision, the way I used to fill out school field trip forms for my son, signing the permission slip with a smile, never knowing how one day he'd ask me to sign myself out of his life entirely. When I clicked send, there was no great fanfare, no thunder rolling in the sky, just a soft whoosh and the confirmation message glowing back at me. Request received. And then I sat there, in the stillness of my own room, the one place that hadn't yet been rearranged by his wife or her mother, the only corner of the house where the pillows still smelled like me. I should have been scared. I was 68 years old. I had arthritis in both knees and a hip that clicked in the mornings. I had no one waiting for me anywhere. No partner. No siblings. Just this passbook of quiet diligence and the bruised remains of a woman who had given everything she had and been told it still wasn't enough. But I wasn't scared. Not yet. What I felt was something quieter, something deeper, a kind of anticipation, like standing at the edge of a pool you haven't dared to swim in for decades. You don't know what the water will feel like, but your toes are already wet. And that's something. I didn't hate them. That would have been easier. What I felt was something sadder. I felt erased. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair by the window, my old robe wrapped tight around me, and watched the moon drift across the sky like it had somewhere to go. I envied it. I imagined what it might be like to disappear into the night like that, quietly, without permission or apology. By morning, I had 3 replies waiting in my inbox. One was from a small seaside town I'd never heard of, somewhere off the coast, tucked away like a secret. The photo showed a simple rental, a single-story cottage with a wraparound porch and ivy crawling up the side. It was nothing like my current house. No grand staircase, no granite countertops, no unnecessary rooms collecting dust and silence. I booked it. 3 months, paid in full. No hesitation. And I did it with a calmness that surprised me. The same way you might pull your coat tighter in a storm, not because it makes the rain stop, but because it reminds you that you're still here, still choosing, still strong. The rest of the day passed in a blur of invisible goodbyes. I started mentally noting what I would take. My books, the blue sweater with the fraying cuffs, my grandmother's rosary, even though I hadn't prayed in years, a photograph of my son at age 10, the last time I remember him looking at me like I was the whole world. I didn't tell them. I didn't make an announcement. There was no big speech at the dinner table. I simply smiled when they talked, nodded when they needed me to agree. And in the spaces where I used to ache for their approval, I now carried something else. A secret, a plan, a destination. I was leaving, not with a bang, but with grace. I didn't rush to pack. There was something sacred about doing it slowly, like peeling away layers of a life I had outgrown. Drawer by drawer, shelf by shelf, I moved through the house like a guest in my own past. My hands lingered on things I once believed I couldn't live without. A vase from our family trip to the mountains. A necklace my son gave me in the 5th grade with Amar One Mom, stamped in cheap metal, still nestled in its faded red box. I left the necklace. Not out of spite. Just release. There was too much history in this house. Too many echoing hallways and moments stored in corners like dust. I had walked these floors barefoot through grief and joy and everything in between. I had cried into these walls, laughed inside them too. But now, every room felt borrowed. Like the warmth had been siphoned out, replaced with noise that didn't include me. They didn't notice I was packing. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't care. That possibility cut deeper. My son walked past me that night in the hallway. His cologne hit first, sharp, modern, unfamiliar. I smiled at him, out of habit. He didn't return it. Just glanced down at his phone and kept walking. I paused for a moment, holding my breath the way you do when you want time to rewind. But it didn't. That was the thing about motherhood no one tells you. How often you'll grieve a child who's still alive. How often you'll miss them while they're standing right in front of you. I left a note, folded and tucked into the corner of the mirror in my room. It didn't say much. Just that I'd be away for a while. That I was safe. That I needed space. I didn't leave a return date, because I wasn't sure I wanted to come back. The morning I left, the house was still. Sunlight poured in like it always did, painting warm rectangles on the floor. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. Hers, probably. My son's shoes sat by the door, neatly lined up like always. Nothing looked different, but everything was. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step a little farewell. To the woman I had been, to the years I had given, to the silence I had swallowed. I stepped outside into air that felt new. The cab driver helped me with my bags. I didn't have much. A suitcase, a canvas tote, a folder of important documents. The rest, the life I had built, the family I had raised, was staying behind. He asked where I was going. I told him simply, to start over. He didn't ask questions. Maybe he'd heard it before. Maybe he saw it in my eyes, that strange cocktail of fear and freedom. That quiet unraveling of a woman stepping out of invisibility and into something unknown. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back. Not at the house. Not at the porch where I had once rocked my baby to sleep. Not at the window where I had waited for my son to come home after prom, after college, after his first heartbreak. Some goodbyes don't need a glance. They need a decision. And I had finally made mine. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, watching the world blur into color and distance. The city faded, replaced by winding roads and tall grass swaying in the wind like it knew how to dance through endings. Every so often my phone would buzz in my bag, and I'd pretend I didn't feel it. I already knew who it was, or who it wasn't. He hadn't called, not once, and neither had she, which told me everything I needed to know. The silence was confirmation that I'd been right to go, that my absence didn't leave a hole big enough to chase. And somehow, even though I had braced myself for it, the truth still stung. I wanted him to come running after me. I wanted the front door to swing open as I stood at the curb that morning. I wanted to hear him call my name with urgency in his voice. To see the boy I once knew break through the man who had grown too comfortable with my silence. But there was no apology, no realization, no mother, wait. There was just the cab and the open road. The driver asked again if I was headed to vacation. I nodded. I didn't correct him. It was easier that way. Simpler to pretend I was just another older woman chasing some peace after years of stress and obligation. But this wasn't a getaway. This was escape. And even escape has its cost. By the time we reached the cottage, the sky had turned a soft shade of blue-gray, the kind that hangs between afternoon and evening like a held breath. I stepped out of the car slowly, stretching my back, my knees stiff from the ride. The air smelled like salt and seaweed and something clean, like a beginning. I stood there for a moment, letting it wrap around me. There was no traffic, no raised voices, no footsteps stomping up the stairs. Just the distant cry of a gull and the rhythmic pull of the tide somewhere beyond the trees. The cottage was smaller than the pictures had made it seem, but somehow more beautiful. Worn shutters, white paint chipping around the windows, a front porch with a single rocking chair that looked like it belonged to someone's grandmother, maybe now, to me. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like lemon and wood polish, the kind of clean that feels lived in, not staged. There was a small kitchen to the left, a cozy sitting room straight ahead, and a bedroom with an old quilt folded at the end of the bed. The furniture didn't match, and nothing was modern. But it was mine. Or at least it would be, for the next 3 months. I dropped my bags by the door and stood still, unsure of what to do next. For the first time in years, there was no one to ask me for anything. No meal to cook, no towels to wash, no conversations to tiptoe around. Just quiet. The kind that feels both like freedom and loneliness. I didn't know which one would win yet. I missed him. God help me, I missed him. Even after everything he said. Even after everything he didn't say. That's the cruel truth about being a mother. Love doesn't dissolve when it's disrespected. It stays. It lingers in the bones. And even when your heart is breaking, it whispers, "He's still my son." I didn't know how to stop that voice yet, so I let it speak. And I rocked, gently, in the chair on the porch, letting the wind blow through my hair, carrying pieces of a woman I used to be, out to sea. The nights were the hardest. When the sun went down and the trees outside the cottage stopped rustling, that's when the stillness settled in. The kind of quiet that doesn't comfort, it confronts. The first night, I lay awake listening to the creak of the old house adjusting to the dark. Every sound felt louder here. The tick of the clock, the groan of the floorboards, the wind curling around the eaves like fingers looking for a way in. I curled under the quilt, my eyes tracing the ceiling, trying not to remember how, just 3 nights before, I had been sleeping in a house where I wasn't welcome. There had been no goodbye hug, no check-in text, not even a single call to ask if I made it safely. Just silence. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I left for me, not to be followed, not to be rescued. But it's a strange thing, realizing you were easier to forget than to fight for. I kept checking my phone anyway. Every hour or so, I'd light up the screen like a fool, hoping to see his name, hoping he'd realized something. Anything. But there was nothing. Only a lock screen photo I hadn't changed, a picture of him on his college graduation day, standing next to me with his arm slung lazily across my shoulder. We were both smiling, but my smile, it looked more like relief than joy. Relief that I'd made it, that I'd gotten him there, that somehow, against every odd, I had done something right. I hadn't looked too closely at that picture in years, but here in the dark, it held me captive. I stared at our faces and wondered if he remembered that day, if he ever looked at that photo and thought about what I gave up to put him in that cap and gown. I remembered the night before that ceremony. I was up until 2, sewing the hem on the slacks he'd only tried on the day before. He had forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning, so I ironed his shirt by hand, whispering silent prayers that the creases would hold. He didn't thank me. Not really. But I didn't need him to. Back then, just being needed was enough. I turned the phone face down on the nightstand, the screen glowing for a few seconds longer before fading into black. There's a loneliness that creeps in after everyone thinks you're fine. The kind that doesn't shout. It settles in your bones, It asks questions that have no answers. Did I stay too long? Did I let him walk over me so many times that it started to feel normal? Did he ever really see me as someone? Or was I always just something? His mother, his cook, his safe place until he no longer needed one. I hadn't come here to be saved. I came here to remember who I was, before I forgot myself trying to be everything to everyone. And maybe, if I stayed quiet long enough, she would come back. I let my mind wander where it wanted to. I thought about how many years I had spent filling other people's cups. How many times I poured out everything I had, and when I was empty, they asked for more. I had made meals with a sore back and driven cross-country with aching wrists. I had said yes so many times I forgot how to spell no. And now, here I was. No apron, no grocery lists, no voices calling from the next room. Just the tide washing over itself, again and again, like forgiveness. I sat down at last, knees popping as I folded them beneath me. The wind played in my hair, wild and untamed, and I didn't brush it back. I let it fall where it wanted. This wasn't healing yet. Not quite. But it was something close. It was presence. Being here. Fully. Without apology. Without needing to earn the right. I pulled the journal from my bag and flipped to a blank page. My fingers hesitated at first, unsure what truth might pour out. But then they moved, steady and slow. Today, I let the ocean hold my sorrow, and it didn't ask me to explain a thing. The tears came again, soft and without ceremony. But this time, they felt different. Not like loss, like release. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt my chest rise without resistance. Like maybe I didn't need him to call. Maybe I didn't need to be needed to be whole. Maybe I just needed to remember how to belong to myself again. And maybe, just maybe, I was beginning. I returned from the shore with sand still clinging to the hem of my skirt and the faint taste of salt on my lips. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, gold-tipped shadows across the path as I walked. My legs ached from the uneven ground, but it was a good ache, the kind that comes not from labor, but from having carried yourself somewhere you didn't think you'd go. The cottage welcomed me in its usual quiet way. The door creaked the same way it always did. The scent of old wood and faint lavender still hung in the air. But something in me had shifted. The silence didn't feel so wide anymore. It wasn't echoing back my sorrow. It was just still, peaceful, honest. I put the kettle on. The water took its time boiling. I didn't rush it. While it warmed, I opened the window and watched the wind chase the branches in slow circles. And as the kettle began to hum, I realized something small but sharp. I hadn't flinched all day. Not once. It's funny how your body keeps score long after your heart has stopped fighting. Back home, every sound was a warning. A door slamming meant I'd said something wrong. A sigh from the living room meant I'd asked for too much. Even silence had edges, sharpened by years of walking on eggshells and calling it love. But here, silence was just silence. And it didn't hurt. I poured the tea and sat at the small kitchen table. I stared at the steam rising from the mug and let my thoughts drift like they had on the water earlier that day. They didn't settle anywhere solid, just floated, touched memories like pebbles on the ocean floor. I wondered if he even noticed I was gone, if he walked past the empty room and felt anything. Guilt, regret, relief. Or if he had already filled the space I left behind with someone more compliant, someone easier to ignore. Her mother, probably. She had always known how to make herself central, how to smile in a way that erased everyone else in the room, how to turn my son's head with just the right tone, just the right blend of passive and poisonous. I hated that she had succeeded. Not because she'd won him over, but because I had watched it happen and still stayed. I had told myself I was keeping the peace, that if I left, he'd fall apart, that he needed me there, even if he never said it. But the truth was harder to admit. I stayed because I was afraid no one would need me at all. But I knew one thing. I couldn't go back. Even if he called tomorrow. Even if he showed up with flowers and apologies, and that wounded look he used to wear when he was little and didn't know how to say sorry. Because something had cracked open inside me. Not broken, just opened. And in that opening, I could feel the beginnings of something unfamiliar and holy. Self. I wasn't there yet. Not fully. But I could feel her. The woman I was before the title of mother took over every corner of my being. She was in the wind, in the waves, in the quiet clink of the mug against the saucer. She hadn't left me. She'd just been waiting for me to come home. And now, at last, I had started to arrive. The next morning, I woke before the sun. No alarm, no footsteps outside my door. Just the natural kind of waking, the kind that happens when your body has rested just enough and your spirit is no longer dreading the day ahead. I lay still for a moment, listening. The cottage was wrapped in silence, not the kind that stings, but the kind that breathes. Gentle, patient. I watched as the darkness gave way to pale gray, then to soft gold, streaks of light crawling across the wooden floor. And for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel the need to jump out of bed and be useful. I didn't feel guilty for taking my time. I just lay there, warm beneath the quilt, my fingers curled lightly around the edge like a child holding on to comfort. The ache in my chest hadn't disappeared. It still hummed softly beneath the surface, like a bruise not yet healed. But it no longer ruled me. It was there, yes, but it didn't speak louder than the wind outside or the quiet promise of a new day. I sat up slowly, my joints stiff, but nothing I couldn't move through. I pulled the sweater over my head and stepped into my slippers, padding into the kitchen like I had 100 mornings before. But this one was mine, entirely mine. No breakfast to prepare for anyone else. No eyes judging the crispness of the toast or the strength of the coffee. Just me, and a quiet hunger I hadn't felt in years. Not for food, but for stillness. For peace. I made my tea and brought it outside, the mug warm in my hands as I stepped into the morning air. The dew sparkled on the grass like tiny promises. The sea, barely visible through the trees, moved in slow motion, like it too had only just woken up. And I sat there, on the same porch that had held me through my first tears in this place, and I simply breathed. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Long enough for the tea to cool and the birds to start their gentle squabbling in the trees. Long enough to remember that time doesn't need to be filled to be meaningful. That silence isn't failure. That rest is not weakness. I let my mind drift again, but this time, it didn't go to him. It went to me. To the girl I once was, long before marriage and motherhood and years of shouldering everyone else's weight. I saw her so clearly, barefoot in the backyard of her childhood home, chasing fireflies with her mouth open in awe. I remembered the way she used to sing to herself while washing dishes, not because anyone was listening, but because her heart was full. And I realized something both tender and devastating. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped singing. Not just with my voice, but with my life. I had dimmed myself so many times to make others feel bright. I had stepped aside so often, I forgot how it felt to walk forward without looking over my shoulder. And now here I was, in a quiet cottage by the sea, being reintroduced to myself. Not by anyone else's definition, not by titles or tasks. Just me. The woman who still cried, who still missed her son, even when he didn't miss her back, who still felt guilt gnaw at her for leaving, even when she knew staying would have destroyed her. I let the tears come again, slow, quiet, reverent. They weren't weakness. They were memory. They were love. They were truth. And I didn't wipe them away, because I wasn't ashamed of feeling anymore. I wasn't trying to be strong in the way the world had told me to be, silent, enduring, invisible. I was learning to be strong in the way I needed to be, present, honest, awake. And as the sun rose fully, spilling gold across the porch and warming my bare knees, I whispered to no one but myself, I am still here, and I am not done becoming. Later that afternoon, I walked into town. The town was small, just a scattering of buildings with chipped paint and windows that let the light in without apology. There was a bakery, a post office, a general store, and a cafe with mismatched chairs on the porch, and an old bell above the door that jingled with every arrival. I paused outside the cafe. There was a woman seated near the window with gray curls pinned back and a book open in her lap. She looked peaceful, untouched by hurry. I watched her for a moment longer than I should have, not because I was being rude, but because something in her stillness made me ache. She wasn't waiting for anyone. That was clear. She wasn't scanning the door, hoping someone would walk through and notice her. She was content to be there, just as she was. Alone, but not lonely. I stepped inside, the bell ringing softly above me. The place smelled like cinnamon and warm bread. The walls were lined with shelves holding used books and local crafts. A chalkboard menu hung above the counter with words written in looping cursive. It was nothing extravagant, but it felt like it had heart, like whoever ran this place had poured themselves into every small detail. I ordered a cup of coffee, black. The girl behind the counter smiled, genuine, not forced, and asked if I wanted a pastry. I almost said no out of habit. For years, I had said no to everything that wasn't necessary. No to sweets. No to new shoes. No to lunch with old friends because someone needed something, or because guilt kept me tethered to obligation. But this time I said yes. A small lemon scone. Soft in the center, with a sugar crust that cracked just right when I broke it in half. I sat by the window, 2 tables over from the gray-haired woman, and let myself just be. No one asked me where I was from. No one stared too long. I was just another stranger passing through, and for once, that anonymity felt like kindness. I took slow sips of my coffee and small bites of the scone, letting myself taste everything. Not just the food, but the freedom. The simplicity of choosing something only for me. And as I sat there, watching the town move at its own sleepy pace, I realized how much of my life had been spent performing. Not on a stage, but in kitchens and living rooms. In whispered phone calls and carefully chosen words. I had spent years trying to be the right kind of mother, the right kind of wife, the right kind of woman. The one who didn't upset anyone. The one who gave everything without asking for much in return. But here, no one expected anything of me. No one knew who I was or who I had been. And maybe for the first time, that was a gift. When I finished my coffee, I stood slowly, brushing the crumbs from my lap. I glanced once more at the woman by the window. She looked up then, and we exchanged a soft smile. One of those quiet recognitions, not of names or faces, but of something deeper, a shared understanding that we had both survived something. As I stepped back outside, the wind picked up, brushing against my cheek like a hand I hadn't felt in a long time. I walked back to the cottage with the sun warm on my back and a scone wrapped in napkin paper for later. And I thought, maybe this is how it happens. Not all at once, but slowly. One step, one scone, one morning where you choose joy over duty. Maybe healing is just choosing yourself again, and again, and again, until it no longer feels like a rebellion, until it feels like home. That evening, I sat on the porch with the untouched half of the scone and watched the sky turn the color of bruised peaches and fading fire. There's a particular kind of stillness that only happens at dusk, when the world seems to hold its breath between the end of one thing and the start of another. I hadn't realized how much I needed that space, that quiet permission to be in between, not broken, not whole, not bitter, not healed, just here. I held the scone in my hand but didn't eat it. It felt like a symbol now, in a strange way. Proof that I had made a choice earlier in the day. A small one, yes, but mine. Something I wanted. Something I said yes to. Not because it was needed. Not because someone else was asking. But because I desired it. And I think that's the part I was trying to remember. That desire is allowed to exist in women like me. That wanting something for myself isn't selfish. That it doesn't need to be justified. The days were beginning to stretch now. Not in the heavy way they did back home, where hours felt like chains dragging me through someone else's comfort. Here, they unfolded like invitations. I was surprised by how much I wanted to answer them. The cottage was starting to feel like a skin I could live in. I knew the soft creak the porch made when I stepped outside barefoot. I knew which kitchen drawer stuck a little when I opened it too quickly. I knew how the wind liked to whistle around the chimney just before midnight. These details, they were beginning to belong to me. But that didn't mean the ache was gone. Grief has a way of showing up even in peace. It knocks in different ways. Sometimes, it's a memory that slides in without warning. Other times, it's the absence of a sound. No one calling your name. No one asking what's for dinner. No footsteps above your head. A part of me still reached for him in small, ridiculous ways. I caught myself once that afternoon, folding the corner of a napkin the way I used to when I packed his lunch for field trips. I hadn't thought about those days in years, but the motion came back like muscle memory, like some small part of me still thought he might come bursting through the door with a backpack full of dirt and stories. But he didn't. And he won't. And that's something I'm learning to live with. I looked out toward the trees as night pressed down around me, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. I was sad. But not in the hollow way that devours you. This sadness had shape. It had a story. It had roots. I missed the version of him that used to need me. The boy who cried on my shoulder when his goldfish died. The boy who whispered, "I love you," without embarrassment. The boy who used to pick dandelions from the yard and call them flowers, even when they made my allergies act up. But that boy was gone. And what remained wasn't something I could hold on to without losing myself. I finally took a bite of the scone. It was a little stale now, but still sweet. There was something beautiful about that. That even after sitting all day, even after being ignored, forgotten, softened by time, it still offered something gentle. Something worth tasting. Maybe I could too. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not erasing the past, not pretending it didn't wound you, but finding the courage to be sweet again. Even after. The stars began to emerge, one by one, quiet and unassuming. I pulled the shawl tighter around my shoulders and leaned back in the rocking chair, the night wrapping around me like a mother I hadn't known I still longed for. And I whispered a soft promise to no one but myself. You're still here. You still belong. And you are allowed to begin again. Have you ever had to choose peace over people? The next morning, I let myself sleep in. There was no alarm clock, no knock at the door, no voice calling up the stairs with a passive-aggressive request for breakfast. It's strange how long it takes your body to realize it's safe, that it doesn't have to be ready to serve, ready to defend, ready to shrink. I woke up slow, the way you do when you haven't felt ownership over your time in years. I lay there with my eyes closed and listened, to the quiet, to the way the wind brushed against the walls, to the faint creak of the cottage adjusting to a new day. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't check the time. I just breathed. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel behind. I eventually moved to the kitchen, bare feet on cool tile, the air already carrying the scent of the sea through the open window. I made myself breakfast, not out of obligation, but because I was hungry. Eggs, toast, a sliced pear. I plated it like someone was coming over, not because they were, but because I was beginning to remember I was worth presenting something to. I ate slowly, at the table, not over the sink, not standing up with one foot out the door. Just me and the quiet, and a meal I made with no one else in mind. And somehow, that felt like rebellion. After the dishes were washed and the counter wiped, I sat on the porch again. The breeze was stronger than usual, tousling my hair and stirring something deeper, something unsettled. Not pain exactly, something older than pain. A question I hadn't asked myself in years. What do you want now? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question lingered, and I let it. Around noon, I decided to go for a walk. Not because I needed groceries, not because anyone asked me to, but simply because I wanted to feel the earth beneath my feet again. I found a spot near the edge, a flat rock just big enough to sit on, and I lowered myself onto it carefully. The wind tugged at my sleeves, and I closed my eyes, letting it move through me. I thought about the day I left, how I didn't slam any doors, didn't throw accusations, didn't even ask for understanding. I had just packed and walked out. Some part of me had been waiting for the moment to explode, for someone to run after me, to stop me, to care. But no one did. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not the betrayal, not the entitlement, but the ease with which they let me go. I had spent decades giving, not just money, but pieces of myself, little offerings in the form of care and compromise. I had bent so far to keep things together that I forgot what it meant to stand tall. And when I finally broke the cycle, they didn't flinch. They simply adjusted the narrative. She's unwell. She's selfish. She's making a scene. No one asked what it cost me to stay all those years. What it did to a woman to be needed, but never cherished. I sat on that cliffside for what felt like hours, staring out at a horizon that didn't care what I had given up. It just was. Vast. Constant. Untouched by approval or blame. I envied it. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was unapologetic. It didn't ask for permission to be expansive. It didn't shrink to fit someone else's comfort. It simply existed. And I think that's what I want too. To exist again without explanation. To take up space without guilt. To be a woman who no longer ties her worth to whether or not she's useful to someone else. I stood, brushing the dust from my sweater, my legs a little stiff from sitting too long. The sun had shifted while I was there, climbing higher into the sky, casting golden light over everything it touched. I walked home slower this time. Not because I was tired, but because I was learning that some journeys don't need to be rushed. Some days are for grieving. Some are for remembering. And some, like this one, are for reclaiming the parts of yourself you thought had been lost forever. The next morning arrived with a soft, steady rain, the kind that doesn't crash, but whispers. It tapped gently against the cottage windows, slid in thin lines down the glass, like quiet reminders of something not yet said. I stayed in bed longer than usual, wrapped in the hush of it, letting it fill the corners of the room. There was something about rain that always made me feel like I was allowed to be still, like the world had finally given me permission to pause. The walk from the cliffs the day before had stayed with me through the night. I had dreamed of water, not the sea this time, but a deep, wide river, and I was standing on the edge of it barefoot, holding something I couldn't quite see. I didn't cross. I didn't throw anything in. I just stood there, waiting. When I woke, the feeling lingered. That heavy, aching quiet. I made tea instead of coffee. Something softer. Chamomile with honey. The kind I used to brew when he was little and feverish, and I would sit at his bedside humming old lullabies I'd forgotten I knew. He'd always liked that, being cared for, even if he didn't say it out loud. Especially then. He'd drink it without a word, and I'd run my hand over his forehead, whispering prayers into the curls damp with sweat. Back then, I was his whole world. And somehow, somewhere along the line, I became the background noise he stopped hearing. I carried my tea to the window and watched the rain blur the garden. The petals on the flowers drooped with the weight of water, bending but not breaking. I thought about that for a long time. How many times I'd bent. How many times I'd let my own needs drip down into the soil while I held up everything around me. It wasn't noble. It was survival. And sometimes, the world rewards you for that kind of quiet self-erasure. Sometimes it calls you strong and selfless and devoted. But those are just prettier words for forgotten. I sat at the kitchen table with the rain as my company and opened my journal. I hadn't planned to write that day. I didn't feel inspired or even particularly clear. But I put pen to paper anyway, and the words came slow, almost shy. Today, I miss the version of me who used to laugh out loud. I think she's still in here. I hope she's not too far gone. I stared at the words for a long time, my eyes blurring with the tears I didn't try to hold back. I used to laugh without shrinking, used to let joy live in my body without apology. But somewhere between slammed doors and silent dinners, between being told I was too much or not enough, the laughter had grown quieter, more careful. I had forgotten how it felt to hear myself without flinching. I used to sing while folding laundry. I used to dance in the kitchen barefoot, just because I could. I used to make pancakes shaped like animals, even when no one asked me to. And now I was here, in a cottage by the sea, holding the memory of those things like a faded photograph, wondering if I could still become her again. Or maybe someone new, someone softer, not because she's broken, but because she's finally stopped hardening herself just to survive. I made lunch without effort, a sandwich, a pear, sliced again. I ate at the window and watched as the rain softened into mist, then lifted. The garden straightened itself little by little, the petals uncurled. I wondered if healing was like that too. Not a lightning bolt, not a trumpet-sounding moment of breakthrough, but a slow uncurling, a gentle straightening, an afternoon where the ache doesn't vanish, but it loosens just enough for you to take a deep breath and know you'll be okay. I washed the dishes and caught my reflection in the window. My hair was messier than usual. My eyes tired, yes, but not empty. There was a flicker there, a quiet light. And as the rain finally stopped and the world turned soft and gold again, I whispered to the woman staring back at me, "You're not lost. You're just returning." That night, the dream came back. The river, the silence, my bare feet at the edge. But this time, I wasn't holding something. I was letting something go. It slipped from my hands like silk, weightless, faceless. And when it hit the water, there was no splash, just stillness, as if the river had been waiting for it. as if it had known all along that I would eventually let it fall. I woke with my heart pounding, my throat dry, the sheets tangled around my legs like vines. The room was dark, but not the comforting kind. It was the kind of dark that presses down on you, the kind that knows your name. I sat up, gasping, my palms damp with sweat. For a moment I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming. The ache in my chest was so sharp, it felt like something had cracked open inside me. And then the thought came, uninvited, but crystal clear. He is never coming back. He was gone. And I was still here, clinging to the bones of a bond that no longer wanted to live. I got out of bed and paced the small hallway, my arms wrapped tightly around myself, as if I could keep the grief from leaking out. But it did. It always did. Grief doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't knock. It doesn't wait for morning. It just enters. Quiet, or violent, or both. It comes when your guard is down and your hope is still flickering like a fool in the corner of your chest. I had held on for too long. To the idea that I mattered to him. To the belief that I was more than a stepping stone to his new life. More than a housekeeper he never paid. More than a placeholder until she arrived and made me obsolete. He had reduced me to a choice. Serve his bride. Or hand over my savings. And I had chosen neither. I had chosen myself. But God, it hurt. It hurt to be forgotten. To be rewritten. To be treated like some footnote in a life I had poured everything into. And I hated myself for still missing him. For still checking my phone once a day, like a woman holding a lantern in a storm, hoping someone she loves is trying to find their way back. But no one was. There was no one on the other side of the darkness. Just me. I stopped in front of the bathroom mirror and flicked on the light. My face stared back at me, puffy, wild-eyed, aging. And I whispered it out loud for the first time. I wasn't just abandoned. I was erased. And the thing that no one tells you about being erased is that you start to believe you were never real to begin with. That maybe you were too much, too emotional, too intense, too demanding, too mother, too woman. That maybe if you had been easier, quieter, more agreeable, they would have stayed. But I had been all those things, and still, they left. So I stopped whispering. I let the fury rise. Not the wild, vengeful kind that burns everything down. Number. This was a different kind of fury. The kind that builds behind the eyes and settles in the spine. The kind that doesn't scream, it stands. It takes back its name. It remembers itself. I looked at the woman in the mirror, really looked, and I said it again, but louder this time. You were never the problem. You loved too much. You bent too far. You stayed too long. But you were never the problem. And I don't know why, but that cracked something open inside me. The tears came, not soft this time. Hard, guttural, shaking. I collapsed to the bathroom floor and let them fall, let them pour, let them drench the silence like rain on dry earth. Because grief isn't tidy. Healing isn't gentle. Sometimes it roars. Sometimes it guts you all over again just when you thought you'd found solid ground. But I let it happen. I let myself break, completely this time. And when the sobs finally slowed, when my breath stopped catching in my throat, I crawled to the sink and splashed water on my face. The mirror fogged from the steam. My reflection blurred, and it felt honest. Because I wasn't trying to hold it together anymore. I wasn't pretending to be fine. I was bleeding in the open. And that somehow was its own kind of strength. I stood there for a long time, palms pressed against the counter, breathing. Just breathing. And I knew I knew in the marrow of me that this was what it meant to rise. Not to forget, not to forgive too soon, but to look yourself in the eye in the middle of the night and say, "You are still here. You are still whole. Even now." The morning after the breakdown came like an offering, gray and quiet. Like the sky itself knew I didn't have the strength for anything bright. I woke on the couch, the throw blanket twisted around my legs, a half-drunk glass of water on the floor beneath me. My throat ached, my eyes burned. But there was a strange kind of clarity in the air, the kind that only comes after the storm has spent itself. Everything inside me felt scraped raw, but also clean, empty in a way that wasn't hollow, but ready. I didn't move right away. I sat there, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the wind push against the cottage. Something inside me had shifted in the darkness. Not in some cinematic way. There was no grand revelation, no sudden surge of strength. It was subtler than that. A quiet refusal. I would not go back. Not to the begging. Not to the bending. Not to the shrinking. Something had broken last night, but maybe it needed to. Because all that pretending, all that I'm fine, all that I understand, all that swallowing of pain just to make other people more comfortable, it had never saved me. It had only made me invisible. I thought about my son's face, that last look he gave me before I left. How his expression didn't change when I packed the suitcase. How he didn't follow me out. Didn't stop me. Didn't even ask if I was okay. I used to think that kind of silence was neutral. Now I know it's violence of its own kind. To see someone unravel and say nothing. To watch a woman give everything and act like it was never enough. That isn't love. That isn't family. That's cruelty wrapped in entitlement. I stood up slowly, my body stiff from sleeping in the wrong position, my knees protesting as I stretched. I made my way to the bathroom, washed the tears from my face, and looked in the mirror, not to check for damage, but to witness. I was still here. Bruised, yes, but breathing. I pulled on a sweater and stepped outside. The sky was low, clouds hanging heavy over the sea. The wind bit at my skin, but I didn't turn back. I walked. Not toward town, not toward the garden. I took the cliffside path again, the one that had felt so sacred the day before. This time, my steps were harder. Not because I was angry, but because I needed to feel the ground under me. I needed to know it could hold me, that I could hold myself. When I reached the edge, I stood with my arms crossed, the wind tugging at my hair, my sleeves, like it wanted to pull me open. And maybe I let it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there and said the truth out loud. I said, "You broke my heart." I said, "You treated me like a burden when I gave you my whole life." I said, "You chose her comfort over my dignity." And then, almost without thinking, I added, "But you don't get to decide who I am now." The words didn't echo. They didn't drift into the sea with some cinematic flourish. They stayed with me. They belonged to me. Because this pain, it wasn't his to carry. It was mine. And I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I had loved him with a fierceness I didn't even understand. The kind of love that mothers don't question, don't measure, don't protect themselves from. I had given him everything. And when he asked for more, when he asked me to serve his bride or surrender my savings, I finally saw what I had refused to see for years. To him, my love was currency. And when I stopped paying, I became disposable. But not to me. Not anymore. I stayed on that cliff until the wind made my fingers numb. And then, slowly, I turned and walked back. Back to the cottage. Back to the warmth of my own breath. back to the quiet, fierce knowledge that no matter what he chose, no matter how far he fell from the boy I once held against my chest, I was done grieving the version of me he refused to honor. I was no longer waiting to be wanted. I was no longer asking to be seen. I was becoming, and I would not go back. The rain returned that night. It wasn't gentle this time. It came down in sheets, loud and relentless, drumming against the roof of the cottage like it had something to prove. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky tear itself open. The storm felt personal, like the sky itself had found the words I couldn't say and decided to scream them for me. I made tea I didn't drink. I lit a candle I didn't need. I sat there in that flickering light, in the echo of thunder, and tried not to feel the sting of being forgotten. But there it was, curling in my gut, climbing my throat, resentment. I hated that it still lived inside me. I hated that even after all the tears, all the walking, all the cliffside reckonings, some part of me still wanted him to come back. To call. To knock on the door soaking wet and say, "Mom, I was wrong." Not because I believed he would, but because there was still a little girl in me who wanted to be chosen. Even now. Even after everything. And I hated that more than anything. Because I wasn't weak. I had survived things he would never understand. I had endured long before he ever knew how to speak, and I'd continue long after he stopped saying my name. But grief doesn't care how strong you are. It finds the softest part of you and makes a home there. I watched the storm rage outside and thought about all the quiet humiliations I had swallowed for the sake of peace. All the times I'd smiled through gritted teeth when she called me dramatic. All the times I sat quietly at that dinner table while they made jokes at my expense, called it teasing, and expected me to laugh. All the times I loaned money and never asked for it back, because asking would have made me difficult. God, I was so tired of being agreeable. I was tired of being the woman who flinched before speaking, who softened her voice so it wouldn't echo too loudly, who folded her needs into smaller and smaller corners until they were invisible, until she was invisible. And now, here I was, alone in a storm, not because I failed them, but because I finally stopped failing myself. The lightning cracked across the sky, and for a moment, the whole world lit up like a photograph. The garden, the stone path, the edge of the woods, all caught in that flash of silver blue, like a memory captured before it disappeared again into black. And in that instant, I saw myself clearly. Not the woman they had tried to make me into, not the shadow they shoved into the margins, but the woman who chose to walk away when staying meant losing everything she had left. I stood up slowly, heart pounding, and opened the front door. The rain hit me like a wall, cold and wild and absolute. I stepped out anyway, barefoot on the porch, wind slapping against my skin, my hair already drenched, and I let it happen. I let the rain soak me. I let the wind scream. I let the storm see me. Because I wasn't hiding anymore. This was my reckoning, my baptism, my proof that I had survived the fire, and now I could survive the flood. I stood there until my legs shook, until my teeth chattered, until my heart steadied. And then I whispered it, to the wind, to the night, to the woman I used to be. You don't belong to them anymore. Not to their guilt. Not to their rewriting. Not to their version of you. You belong to yourself now. I walked back inside, dripping and shaking, but something in me had gone quiet. Not dead. Not numb. Just still. Like a storm that's finally passed through. I peeled off the wet clothes and wrapped myself in something warm. dry, mine. And for the first time in what felt like years, I climbed into bed not with dread or grief, but with a strange kind of reverence, like I had done something sacred. Because I had. I had stood in the middle of the storm, barefoot and unashamed, and claimed my place in the world again. Not as a mother, not as a servant, not as a casualty, but as a woman who walked through fire, stood beneath thunder, and still chose herself. And when sleep finally came, it wasn't a collapse, it was a homecoming. I woke up to light, not the gray, tentative kind that slips in quietly through the curtains. This light was bold. It filled the room like it had been waiting for me, like it had known somehow that I had finally survived the night. The storm had passed. Outside, the trees stood rinsed and shining. The garden looked reborn. And the sky, clear, endless, not a single cloud left to threaten me. I sat up slowly, the sheets clinging to my skin, and felt something unfamiliar in my chest. Not joy, not peace, not exactly, but power. The quiet kind. The kind that settles deep, like roots after a long drought. I had been broken open, hollowed out by grief and betrayal, and somehow, in the emptiness, I had found space to breathe again. I stayed still for a long time, just listening. There was no sound from him, no phone call, no apology. But I didn't flinch this time. I didn't wait for the chime of a message, or wonder if I'd missed a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anything anymore, and that was its own kind of freedom. The woman who woke up that morning wasn't the same woman who had paced the hallway in the middle of the night, trembling under the weight of what had been taken from her. That woman had begged for scraps of love, folded herself into someone else's comfort, and called it sacrifice. But this woman, me, I wasn't begging anymore. I wasn't hoping for repair. I was building something else entirely. I got up and walked to the mirror, expecting the usual heaviness to return. The reminder of age, of time, of all that had been given and not returned. But what I saw surprised me. I looked strong, not polished, not young, but strong in a way that had nothing to do with smooth skin or soft eyes. Strong in the way tree bark is, rough, worn, but impossible to break. I looked into my own reflection, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I owed her an apology for all the years I'd abandoned her. I whispered, "I'm here now." And I meant it. Later that day, I walked down to the shore. The path was muddy from the rain, and I nearly slipped twice, but I laughed each time. Really laughed. Loud, unfiltered. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything. Just because something in me remembered how. The sound startled a few birds from the tall reeds, and I let them go, the way I'd been learning to let so much else go. When I reached the beach, I stood there for a long time, watching the waves roll in, bold and unapologetic. The ocean didn't ask for permission to take up space. It didn't ask if it was too loud, too much, too constant. It existed in full force, and I loved it for that. I walked closer to the edge and slipped off my shoes. The water was cold when it met my toes, but I didn't step back. I let it rise, up my ankles, over my calves. I walked until the waves reached my knees, and I stood there, arms loose at my sides, heart beating steady. I thought about every version of myself I had lost to them, to their needs, to their stories, to their revisions of me that made them the heroes, and me the ungrateful one. I thought about the years spent proving I was worthy, the decades of being useful, invisible, polite. And I made a decision, right then, knee-deep in the sea. I would no longer shrink to be understood. I would no longer soften myself to make them comfortable. If my strength scared them, so be it. If my voice unsettled them, let it. If my joy was too loud, they didn't have to stay. Because this life, this one precious, beautiful, battered life, was mine now. Every scar, every heartbreak, every breath that still came after the silence. Mine. I walked back to shore slowly, feeling the salt on my skin, the earth in my steps. I carried something with me now, something sacred, a knowing, a reckoning, a promise. And when I returned to the cottage, I sat down at the old kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not to him, not to her, not to anyone who had tried to unwrite me, but to the woman I had finally come home to. It said, I see you. I love you. I will never leave you again. And when I signed my name at the bottom, my hand didn't shake. Because I knew now, deep in my bones, that I was never theirs to destroy. I had always belonged to me. I kept the letter on the table all day. Folded in half, edges sharp, my name penned at the bottom in a hand I barely recognized as mine. Steadier, fuller, like something inside me had found its voice and refused to let go. Every time I passed it, something in me paused. It wasn't just paper. It was proof. Not for anyone else. Just for me. That I had finally chosen myself, written it down, and meant it. But something else lingered too. That night, I didn't sleep. Again. The sky was clear, the wind soft, but inside me, the storm had shifted. Not violent like before, not raw, but quiet, focused, as if the grief had given way to clarity. Not peace, no, not yet, but something sharper. A recognition of what had truly been done to me. I had been robbed, not just of money, not just of home, but of years, of energy, of moments I'll never get back. And it hadn't been a single theft. It had been slow, deliberate, like erosion. Tiny pieces of me chipped away each time I said yes when I meant no. Each time I was called dramatic or selfish for setting a boundary. Each time I was expected to give, to smile, to serve, to disappear. I had made myself smaller for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be whole. That kind of theft doesn't make noise. It doesn't break the door down. It convinces you to hand over the key. And then one day you look around and realize you don't recognize the house you're standing in, or the woman who built it. I sat by the fire, wrapped in my grandmother's quilt, the letter still on the table, untouched. And I thought about the moment everything had changed, the moment he stood in my kitchen, voice cold, eyes already somewhere else, and told me I had two choices: serve his bride, or hand over my savings, like I was some maid left on retainer, like I had no history, no soul, no worth beyond what I could provide. He said it so plainly, like it was reasonable, like my only value was how well I could be repurposed. And I remember I stood there, stunned, heart racing, mouth dry, because something in me, something primal, understood that this wasn't just about money. This was about power, about rewriting the roles, about erasing the mother who had raised him and replacing her with a servant who would stay quiet in the background. And it wasn't just him. It was the way she looked at me, his wife-to-be, like I was a relic, like I was something to be tolerated until I got in the way. And the worst part? The part I still can't scrub from my mind? He let her. He stood there and let her. Not even a flicker of discomfort on his face. Like I was a transaction being completed. And I've turned that moment over in my mind again and again, trying to find where I went wrong. What I said. What I didn't say. Wondering if I should have shouted. Slapped the counter. Walked out. But the truth is, I froze. Like a child in a burning room, waiting for someone else to put the fire out. And no one did. So I walked into the flames myself, packed my things, took what was left of my pride, left the key on the table, and now here I was, alone, awake, rebuilding, but not begging, not breaking, becoming. I stood up, barefoot on the old floorboards, and walked to the window. The sea shimmered under the moonlight, vast and unapologetic. And I whispered something, not to him, not to her, but to the old version of me, the one I had carried like a ghost for too long. I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry for leaving. I'm not sorry for choosing silence instead of screaming. I'm not sorry for starting over. And I'm not sorry for refusing to serve a table that would never feed me. I turned away from the window and looked back at the letter. It was still there, waiting. A mirror in ink. A promise I hadn't made in decades. I picked it up, held it in both hands, and then I pressed it to my chest. Not because I needed to believe it, but because I already did. This wasn't a rescue. It was a return. To myself. To my name. To the fire that never really went out, no matter how hard they tried to smother it. And tomorrow, I would burn brighter. Morning didn't sneak in. It announced itself. Not with light, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows something final. The kind that waits for you to notice it. I opened my eyes and knew, even before I sat up, that something in me had closed for good. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. There was no breathlessness in my chest, no familiar panic clawing its way up my ribs. Just calm. Cold and clean, like a sharp wind through an open door. Like a house that's been swept bare. I had crossed something. Not a finish line. Not a threshold. A severance. Some invisible thread that had tied me to their world, their expectations, their warped memory of who I used to be. It snapped last night. Or maybe I cut it. I'm not sure. I just knew, with a clarity that didn't need to shout, that I didn't belong to that story anymore. I rose, barefoot, and padded through the house like I was walking through someone else's memory. Everything was the same. The chipped blue mug on the counter, the quilt thrown over the arm of the chair, the faint scent of lavender from the sachet in the linen drawer. But I was different. I was no longer waiting. I wasn't waiting for his voice to come through the phone, filled with remorse. I wasn't waiting for her to stumble into guilt, for her to realize what she'd done. I wasn't waiting for the apology that would never come, or the explanation that would never make it right. I had waited for years. Waited while they drained me. Waited while they rewrote the narrative to make themselves innocent. Waited while I fed everyone's hunger and starved quietly in the corner. But that wait ended the night I stood in the rain and felt it baptize the part of me that still thought I needed to earn love by disappearing. I wasn't disappearing anymore. I was taking up space. Fully. Finally. I brewed tea, but this time I didn't sit at the window, searching the horizon. I sat at the table, unfolded the letter I'd written to myself, and read it slowly, line by line, like scripture. I see you. I love you. I will never leave you again. Each sentence hit like truth, like something I had longed to hear my entire life, but didn't know I could say to myself. I didn't cry. Not this time. I didn't need to. The tears had done their job. Now came the rebuilding. I thought about the money he tried to take, the savings I had scraped together from every scrap of a paycheck, every sacrifice, every moment I said no to myself so I could say yes to him. And he wanted it, without thanks, without grace, just expected it, as if it was his inheritance by default. As if the years I spent giving didn't belong to me anymore. But they did. They always had. And now I was finally taking them back. He hadn't just asked for money. He asked for my silence. He asked for the comfort of knowing that even in betrayal, I'd still choose him. That even in disregard, I'd stay loyal. that I would hand over the last of myself and call it love. But I said no, not loudly, not violently, but completely. And that no had become my freedom. I stepped outside just before noon. The air was thick with the scent of the ocean, the kind of heaviness that makes everything feel alive. I walked the garden slowly, my fingers trailing across petals, the sun warm on my shoulders. I didn't think about what they would say if they saw me now. I didn't imagine their faces, their reactions, their disapproval. Because I wasn't living in their gaze anymore. I was learning how to live in my own. I knelt near the rosemary and pulled a few sprigs, rubbed them between my fingers, inhaled the sharp, grounding scent. It reminded me of my mother. Her apron always stained, her hands rough, her love stern but steady. She would have never let herself be pushed to the margins like I had been. She would have stood taller, sooner. And maybe now I was finally learning what she had always known. A woman doesn't have to bleed to be good. A woman doesn't have to break herself to be worthy. A woman doesn't have to serve to deserve a place at the table. She simply is. And that is enough. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my knees, and walked back toward the cottage with slow, certain steps. There was no parade waiting for me, no chorus of approval, just the sound of my own breath and the rhythm of my own feet. But that was the victory. Not being loved, not being understood, but being whole, being here, being mine. And tomorrow? I didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But for the first time, that didn't terrify me. I didn't need a plan. I didn't need permission. I had the sky. I had the sea. I had my own name written in my own hand. And I had the knowledge, deep, unshakable, that I would never be lost again. The house is quiet now. Not the silence of absence, not that brittle stillness that once haunted the corners, but something softer, something whole. The kind of quiet that comes after the war has ended, and you've swept the floor, made the bed, and lit a candle just because you can. There's a stillness in me now where there used to be ache. Not because everything is fixed. Not because he called. He didn't. Not because they apologized. They haven't. But because I stopped waiting. I stopped begging to be seen by people who had already closed their eyes. There's no audience anymore. No applause. The letter still sits in the drawer beside my bed. I don't read it every day. I don't need to. Just knowing it's there, my own words, written in my own hand, is enough. Some nights, I take it out and press it to my chest. Not to remember, but to remind. That I made it. That I chose myself. That I never have to explain that choice to anyone again. Today, I planted lavender near the steps. The soil was damp and forgiving, the sun warm on the back of my neck. As I pressed the roots down, I thought of how many things I've buried over the years. The love that turned sour. The loyalty that wasn't returned. The younger version of me who thought she had to keep bleeding to be worthy. But this was different. This wasn't burying. This was planting. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting. Not pretending it didn't happen. But digging your hands into the same earth that once held your grief and daring to grow something new in it. I sat on the porch after, dirt under my fingernails, watching the wind move through the trees. The same trees that had stood here all along, through the rain and the reckoning. And I realized, so had I. And if you ask me now who I am, I wouldn't start with what I've lost. I wouldn't lead with their betrayal or my pain. I'd tell you this. I am the woman who walked out. I am the woman who didn't hand over her savings, or her silence, or her soul. I am the woman who chose a quiet cottage over a gilded prison, who chose her own name over theirs, who chose peace over performance, and I survived. That's the story. That's the ending. I survived. Thank you for being here. Her journey was heavy, but it led her back to herself. Watch another powerful story by clicking on the left, and don't forget to subscribe for more voices that deserve to be heard.